The word essential has been used more since March than I can remember. Who is an essential worker? What is essential travel? What stores are essential and must stay open? Mark Wafer owned 6 Tim Hortons restaurants in Scarborough. Mr. Wafer, who is hearing impaired, didn't think he did anything extraordinary when he hired Clint, a young man with Down syndrome. Mr. Wafer said, "There were other applicants, but because of the barriers that I faced as a deaf youth trying to find jobs, I knew Clint's chances were slim, so I took a chance and I hired him." Mr. Wafer hired Clint because he has a high level of empathy. In a span of more than 20 years, Mr. Wafer hired 127 people with disabilities to work in his restaurants. And while each hire came with the challenge of figuring out specific accommodations, each person turned out to be more capable than Mr. Wafer had assumed. On this complicated Rosh Hashanah morning, I would like to suggest that empathy is an essential human trait that we all need to lean into in this uncertain time. Everyone is experiencing their own form of grief and loss, and they need us. Empathy sometimes gets confused with sympathy, but they are two very different emotions. Sympathy is like when you say to someone, "I feel bad for you." Empathy is like when you say to someone, "I feel bad with you." Sympathy can make us feel more alone, while empathy can help us feel connected. To quote Dr. Brené Brown, empathy isn't about fixing. It's the brave choice to be with someone in their darkness and not to race to turn on the lights so we feel better. Long before he became president, Barack Obama publicly began to speak and write about the need for empathy. Most famously, in a 2006 Northwestern University commencement address, he said, "We should talk more about our empathy deficit, the ability to put ourselves in someone else's shoes and to see the world through those who are different than us, the child who's hungry, the laid-off steel worker, or the immigrant woman cleaning your dorm room. When we use empathy, we connect ourselves to others." This past summer, Dr. Micha Goodman from the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem taught that responding to situations with empathy is actually a skill. Some people are good at it, and some people not so much. And he also presented empirical evidence that showed how empathy is down by 40% in the world. This is a huge challenge. We need to rewire ourselves to continuously cultivate empathy so that we can better connect to people and build a world of love and chesed. Cultivating empathy can be difficult. There are many roadblocks to being empathetic. As Obama shared with those Northwestern graduates, as you go on in life, cultivating this quality of empathy will become harder, not easier. There's no community service requirement in the real world. No one is forcing you to care. You'll be free to narrow your concerns to what's going on in your own little circle. Well, that way of living, it just runs contrary to our Jewish values. In Leviticus 19, we read, "Ki yagur itcha ger be'artzechem." When a stranger resides with you in your land, lo tonu oto. You shall not wrong him. Ke'ezrach mikem yeh lachem hager agar itchem. The stranger who resides with you shall be to you as one of your citizens. Ve'ahavta lo kamocha. And you shall love him as you love yourself. For you were strangers in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. We are commanded 36 times to love the stranger, the person who is different than us. We are commanded to feel the feelings of the stranger because we have been the stranger. Said in other words, we should have empathy to the other. But here's the paradox. It's easier for us to show empathy for people who are like us. And we're just wired to pay more attention and have empathy for people like us than we are for people who are different than us. It's easier to be empathetic towards people in our homes and our family, and it often just comes less naturally with other people. Too often, the people who need our empathy the most receive our empathy the least. To quote Rabbi Scheiheld, one of the Torah's central projects is to turn memory into empathy and moral responsibility. Appealing to our experience of defenselessness in Egypt, the Torah seeks to transform us into people who see those who are vulnerable and exposed rather than looking past them. We have to shrink the distance between ourselves and our past, and we're reminded of this each Pesach when we say, B'chol dor vador, chayav adam lirot et atzmo ki'ilu hu yatsa mimitzrayim. In every generation, we must look at ourselves as if we have just left Egypt. If we internalize that, then we know how it feels to be a have-not. And we often miss the mark at Rosh Hashanah, especially with our responses to the Torah readings. Both narratives offer two great teachings about missed opportunities for empathy. But so often we seek and we share other messages found within the Torah. On the first day of Rosh Hashanah, we watch three characters in the same generation involved in a sort of love triangle. We have Abraham, Sarah, and Hagar. And traditionally, we've been taught that the heroes of the story are Abraham and Sarah, and the Torah sets it up that way, beginning with the words, V'Adonai pakad et Sarah ka'asher amar, and God took note or remembered Sarah as promised. Eventually, Sarah gives birth to Isaac, and the promise from God is actualized. A few verses later, Sarah sees Isaac playing with Ishmael, the son of Hagar, Abraham's concubine, the woman who was able to give birth first. And then Sarah says, Garesh ha'ama hazot ve'et bana. Cast away that slave woman and her son. Just get rid of her. For the son of that slave shall not share in the inheritance with my son Isaac. And while we read that Abraham gets distressed about what happens to Hagar, God introduces Abraham to the expression, happy wife, happy life. And he commands Abraham to follow his wife's request. Being that it is Rosh Hashanah, the birthday of the world, and a return to the beginning of our story, it's natural that we root for the covenant to occur for Abraham and Sarah to have land and progeny. But Nachmanides, the Ramban, writing in the 1200s, he was ahead of his time because this is what he wrote about this crucial point in our narrative. He wrote, our mother Sarah sinned in how she treated Hagar, and Abraham sinned as well in enabling Sarah to act that way. Sarah had no empathetic resonance. She didn't for a moment tune into Hagar's feelings. They should not have kicked Hagar out. That was not empathy. It was not kind. It was cruel. To be sure, God was empathetic towards Hagar and her son, because we read that God heard the cry of the boy, and an angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said, "What troubles you, Hagar? Fear not. God has heeded the cry of the boy where he is." So divine empathy was present in the narrative, but the human characters, Abraham and Sarah, showed little empathy or tolerance. Being empathetic and exhibiting chesed, loving kindness, is one way that we can aspire to live our lives in the image of God. So if empathy is the ability to put yourself in someone else's shoes and imagine how they feel. Do we pause enough on Rosh Hashanah morning to empathize with Hagar when we hear this narrative being chanted? Have you ever felt left out? How many of us have never once felt pushed aside for not being part of a group? Because Hagar is not essential to the central story of the Jewish people and the covenant that God made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, she is relegated to the role of the stranger, of the other. How different would our central story be if each Rosh Hashanah we were explicitly encouraged to empathize with Hagar along with all of our other explicit themes like the shofar, teshuvah, tefillah, and tzedakah. Empathy towards others requires us to pay better attention to those outside of our circle. Our devotion and our empathy to our family and our community will not diminish when we show empathy to others. Now, using our 2020 COVID-19 lens, the Rosh Hashanah second day Torah reading from Genesis 22 is also a missed opportunity for empathy. Abraham is tested by God and asked to sacrifice his favorite child, Isaac, on an altar to God. And even though the Jewish people have never engaged in human sacrifice, as the story unravels, Abraham goes through with it. He goes through the steps in order to actually do it. Now, Sarah, the mother of the child, is absent. Each year I return to this story and look at it anew, but this year I can only empathize with Sarah. She was not with her husband and son. She dealt with the trauma alone, off stage, with her emotions not documented for us. Like Sarah, during and after the Akedah, so many of us have struggled alone this year. As we practiced quarantine, isolation, and physical distancing, so many of us suffered and are continuing to suffer alone. We could not reach out to hug others. We couldn't put our arms around our family and friends and say, I don't know what to say, but I love you and I'm here for you. And even if we connected over the phone and on our various video platforms, it's just not the same as sitting next to someone in their fear, their grief, or their disappointment. It might be a good second option, but it's not the same. And if we're not physically with someone, we don't always figure out how they're feeling or how they're doing because we can't pick up on physical cues. A big challenge that we all face, according to Dr. Christian Keizers of the Social Brain Lab at the Netherlands Institute of Neuroscience, is that people have an empathy off switch, and it's strong enough to override the instinct to be kind. Sarah and Abraham, they used their off switch when they banished Hagar. From all that I've read about him, I don't think that Mr. Wafer, the Tim Hortons franchise owner, had that kind of an off button. He saw no hindrance to hiring people with disabilities at his restaurants. He said, what I faced as a young man is the reason why I have empathy towards people with disabilities. All of society discriminates against them. It doesn't matter if you're deaf, blind, or in a wheelchair. I witnessed it firsthand, and I saw it happening to others. And that's why I knew I was going to hire Clint the moment he walked through the door. It would be remarkable if instead of an empathy deficit, social scientists and researchers started to speak this year about an empathy surplus and how worldwide empathy has gone up by 40% and not down. It's a new year. Let us be the leaders and start this upward trend. We all have the capacity to cultivate empathy towards others. It's a practicable and a teachable skill. We have room in our hearts to care both for those we love and those we have never met. Hillel taught, Do not judge your fellow man until you have reached his place. Of course we shouldn't judge, but we need to put ourselves in other people's shoes for a moment and connect to their pain and fear. It is so easy to hear the loud cry of a shofar. We anticipate it and we wait for it from one year to the next. The question to ask yourself as we enter into this new year is, what are the cries that I am not hearing, and how can I be more empathetic towards them? Shana Tova.